into through a home rule message with the state. And it's worth looking into because these kinds of dollars are going to be very hard to come by from within our community. We're going to have to be looking to the state and federal government for a lot of grants to pay for some of these programs. But what we need to do as a city is when we do invest in transit and bike infrastructure and pedestrian infrastructure, we need to all understand that this is worthwhile investment because the payoffs are huge in terms of health, in terms of vehicle wear and tear, in terms of road wear and tear. So this is an investment that does end up paying for itself. But in terms of finding seed money for things like solar installations, that is difficult.
And Ms. Barnhart, this question will be answered by you first. Busing is currently provided by the Rochester Genesee Regional Transportation Authority. How can your office influence their ability to improve and increase service? Or do you have other plans for increasing access to and use of mass transit?
Right, we have to do both. The city of Rochester has to work with our largest employer, the University of Rochester, to get the U of R to encourage its employees to take the bus. Maybe they can give free bus passes, maybe they can provide funding to RTS. And it was very disappointing that the U of R was allowed to nix a transit hub at College Town. That is a decision that we'll be paying for a long time. As mayor, I can advocate to make sure that that infrastructure is in place and that entities like the U of R are on board when it comes to transit. And we have to work with our county and state to make sure that when we are making decisions about awarding tax breaks, awarding grants, that companies are taking transit into account. Because we can push RTS all we want to be better, but there's only a certain amount of funding. What we can do is make sure that when we're locating new things, that they're locating on places that people can access.
The fact that the RTS, Greater Rochester Regional Transit System, is a public entity means that it has a responsibility to the public. And some of that includes the actual routing of the busing. You know, one of the things that stood out for me is the fact that if you wanted to leave Charlotte and go to a certain area in Irondequoit, you'd have to get on a bus, go downtown, and then go back out the same distance to get to that place in Irondequoit. So we need to have them, work with them to change the routing system so that it's more accessible and more pertinent to the people who have job needs or travel needs that will reduce that time on the bus. I also think it would be very important for us to have certain areas of the city which you cannot drive cars. You know, many years ago I had the vision of maybe taking the interloop and making that the zone in which the buses ran around the interloop, but if you were coming downtown, you got off and you walked into downtown and did your business, either go to work or to go shop and things of that matter. And that way you can encourage people to walk, you can reduce the number of people in cars, and then we need to have a situation where we no longer allow one vehicle or one person vehicles to access our city roads.
I'm just going to circle back to that question because sometimes I'm a little slow on the uptake. And I just want to make sure I heard you clearly say how your office would influence the RGRTA's ability to improve and increase service. How would your office influence that? I think you talked about things that could be improved. How would your office influence that? And I would ask the timer to give 30 more seconds to each candidate to just respond, and we'll go in the same order. Mr. Shepherd and Ms. Vice versa, Ms. Barnhart and Mr. Shepherd. 30 seconds to just say how your office would influence the RGRTA. Ms. Barnhart first, Mr. Shepherd.
Well, the city does have appointees on the RGRTA board, but more than that, I think we have to recognize that our community simply isn't set up for RTS to serve every corner. It's just not. We would have to provide so much more funding to RTS to do that, and that's why the focus shouldn't just be on making RTS improve service, which it should do, but it also has to be on planning, or else we are never going to fix this problem.
And as I stated earlier, with the RTS being a public entity, and there are members of city government that are on their board, we need to use that influence to change how they do their business. It shouldn't just be a matter of us asking, but it should be a matter of us being in a position where we actually can influence what they do relative to the routing, relative to the circumstances of how people travel the bus routes, and like I said earlier, creating certain zones within the city in which vehicles are not allowed.
Thank you, Mr. Shepherd. And Ms. Barnhart. Would you promote healthy homes by getting the medical community to work more closely with the energy efficiency and housing communities? Mr. Shepherd.
Could you repeat the question?
Would you promote healthy homes by getting the medical community to work more closely with the energy efficiency and housing communities? If so, how?
I think it's very important in terms of the education that we do with people who are moving into homes and building homes, in terms of working with our medical community, in terms of educating people into the factors that can contribute to negative health. You know, we've had such a very strong anti-smoking effort in terms of education and getting the word out. I think in terms of what we do in terms of people's homes and what the medical profession can do to help us determine how we build, what energy we use, and how that can impact our health needs to be communicated so people can make informed decisions.
You know, I've never considered having the medical community be part of a discussion on making our homes more energy efficient. When I think of the medical community and healthy homes, I mostly think about lead abatement in the city, which remains a problem for many of our youth. And they certainly have been on the front lines of making sure that our homes are safe and that we're doing more to make sure that we are eradicating lead and testing children for lead. If there are other things that the medical community can do to make sure that our homes are healthy, to make sure that our children living in our city homes are healthy, I'm all for it and open to any ideas.
I just want to challenge our candidates to be as specific as possible. I think that's what the audience is looking for, not so much generalities, but specific kinds of tactics and strategies you consider using. And so I just urge you to think in those terms about specificity in your responses. Ms. Barnhart, would you support strengthening local building codes above and beyond what New York State mandates to require more stringent energy efficiency standards? This is legally possible.
It is, and I'm going to answer this the same way that I answered the question about the C of O and making sure our rental properties are efficient. I think this is an incredible goal and that Rochester could really be on the map, but I do think we have to study it first because there are a lot of people who would be impacted. Builders would be impacted, developers impacted, tenants would be impacted because they'd have to pay. So I do think we have to analyze cost, we have to analyze the feasibility of this, we have to analyze the outcomes. Because if you're going to do something like this, you have to make sure that you're getting the outcome that you want. So I'm very enthusiastic about going in that direction, but I do think we need to get stakeholders at the table and we have to study it first.
And I do think the city of Rochester can be a leader in terms of setting up energy efficiency standards. I think in terms of what we put out there shouldn't necessarily be something that we say going backwards, properties that have already been established, but things that are built in the future so that we can take advantage of over a period of time and we become fully energy efficient in everything that we build in this city. I know that it would be very cost prohibitive to say that, you know, effective January 1st, everything has to go to a certain standard, but I do think it would be appropriate for us to have a standard that say buildings built after 2025 will be energy efficient.
Mr. Shepherd, one of the Climate Action Plan strategies is urban agriculture. How do you plan to implement this piece? And then it says, what will be your first steps? Who will you partner with? Things of that nature.
In terms of urban agriculture, I think it's very important for community members, community organizations, to be empowered and assisted by city government. We have certain neighborhoods in this city, such as Josiana, who have been leaders in taking advantage of agriculture in their neighborhood. And I think it's very important, like I said, that community organizations do take the lead. I think it's also very important in terms of us helping people be sustainable. You know, we talked about climate events that may occur. By having neighborhoods with green energy, food, agriculture, when some of these things occur, they're not reliant on the store being closed and not being able to feed themselves, because they do have something that already in place where they can get food and sustain their families.
The first thing the city has to do is come up with a comprehensive plan for urban agriculture. We don't have one right now. There's no specific policies for urban agriculture in the city, so every now and then you do hear about people saying, the city just tore up my garden. What am I gonna do now? And so that's why we need to have a policy and we need to have a plan. And that plan should identify potential plots where we can allow urban agriculture. And what does that look like? Who gets to do that farming? People who own the land? Is it a community plot? Are these vacant plots owned by the city? You've got to set up rules, and so the first thing that I would do is come up with a plan that would include very specific policies regarding urban agriculture, a blueprint that anyone can follow if they want to set up shop.
How do you feel about asking people to cut back on methane gas by changing their diets, such as eat less meat? I didn't write it. I'm a vegetarian, but I didn't write that. Especially since methane gas is the much more dangerous, life-threatening gas coming from animal agriculture for planet Earth.
My first?
You are first, Ms. Barnhart.
Honestly, I don't think that's a place I would want to spend a lot of time and energy. Certainly, there's nothing wrong with educating people about healthy eating and the impact that their choices have on the environment. No problem with that, but I don't know that I want to get that involved in telling people what to eat.
And I don't think it's a matter of us telling people what to eat. I do think it's a matter of us reducing methane gas in terms of what we do with the farm industry. So much of what we see in this country relative to the investment that we've made in cattle, sheep, and different meat products does contribute to this problem. I'm going to be honest, I'm a big time meat eater, and it's hard for me to walk away from it, but I think if we do highlight the health issues relative to meat consumption and the chemicals that go into meat consumption and these other things, we can preach our agenda without preaching our agenda.
Okay, this one is rather long. Buildings vary greatly in energy use intensity. Benchmarking is a way to measure that intensity so that potential buyers can compare the energy usage of certain properties. Would you support a mandatory benchmarking program for commercial and/or residential properties, the goal of which is to create demand for energy-efficient properties? Mr. Shepherd.
I would definitely support to have a benchmarking standard for commercial properties. And again, I don't think it's something that we can put in place effective January 1st, but I think that if we had a sliding scale so that by a certain date, 2025, every building that was going through sale or being built in the city of Rochester would meet a certain standard. I think would also be beneficial too in the residentials, not the apartment type of places, but in single family homes, that we do have benchmarking so that people are aware of what they're using in terms of their carbon footprint and what their energy needs are, and they can make an informed decision to whether they're going to buy that property or not.
I think the first thing that we have to do is get the knowledge about our energy use. We need to map the energy use in our city. creating an energy use map would give us the tools that we need to decide where we want to focus our efforts in reducing emissions. That's step number one. Step number two can then be figuring out how do we want to benchmark. But first, I think we need that knowledge. We don't have an energy map right now. And then we can figure out what direction we need to go in and what standards we want to set. And if we want to make them a requirement or if we want to make them goals. I do support eventual benchmarking, but I think first we need to have the knowledge about where we are.
From the Rochester Youth Climate Leaders. Rochester is becoming more bike friendly, yes. What's next on the agenda to get more people using bikes instead of cars? Ms. Barnhart.
The biggest barrier to people, particularly women, riding bicycles is safety. People don't want to get on their bikes if they don't feel safe. It's a chicken and the egg problem. Because how many times do you hear people complain, oh, they built the bike lane and there's nobody in it? Well, that's because people don't feel safe. What we need to do is build more protected bike lanes, and we need to build more trails, and we need to make sure that these are all connected to places that people actually go. We're not there yet, and it's the direction that we have to go in. Bicycle infrastructure is imperative. We may be a city that has snow for many parts of the year, but there are other cities in North America that are more wintry than us, like Montreal, and they have year-round biking culture. We can do that in Rochester, but it's going to take an investment in the infrastructure because study after study has shown if you build it, they will come.
And earlier I mentioned the fact that we could create car-free zones. Same we said within the inner loop proper, no cars could travel our roadways, and we encourage people to take bicycles. And we know we have this new program with the bikes that anybody can utilize to get go from one side of town to the other side of town. I think we can have a tremendous impact in the use of bikes. I think we also need to have a much greater enforcement relative to the traffic laws and how they pertain to bicycles and bicycle riders. So often when I talk to people about that do like to ride bikes and how they travel, some of the things they complain about is the failure of people in cars to think about the people that are riding bikes and be aware of their presence on the road. So by having a education component and an enforcement component, we can make it safer for people to be on bikes, and therefore there'll be more people willing to ride bikes.
Please describe an initiative you will champion that simultaneously addresses both climate change and poverty in our inner city. Mr. Shepherd.
Give it to me again.
Sure. Please describe an initiative you will champion that will simultaneously address climate change and poverty in our inner city.
I think in terms of addressing poverty in our inner city, we have to make sure that we have, we're talking about all these regulations that we'd like to put in place. We have to make sure that these regulations do not impact the persons who are most impacted by climate change, and that is those who are living in poverty, those who are poor. And so in some of these instances, we may have to have a double standard relative to expectations. Say if we're going to say that every house will be energy efficient by 2025, we may have to have a standard in which we're not putting as much a burden on those who have less in those communities. Also in terms of poverty, and I'm a very strong advocate for education. And I think by educating our youth, again, with the STEM, relative to different strategies where they can take the lead within their own homes to reduce their carbon footprint and the energy that we use, will put us in the place that we want to be in terms of having an educated community.
I talked to you about City First economic development policy, so I won't repeat that. But there is something else that we can do that, believe it or not, is related to poverty and climate, and that is a citywide fiber internet network. We've already built the grid. Taxpayers own it. Much of the fiber is dark. we can wire every single home in Rochester and offer the internet for free at the speeds we currently get from Spectrum and Frontier. The network would be sustained by businesses looking for low-cost fiber, gigabit service, and families who want to pay for gigabit service. What does it have to do with poverty? Well, half of our city kids do not have internet at home. How are they going to compete? We can have the next Steve Jobs. That kid needs to learn how to code at home. And what does it have to do with climate? Smart grid. I believe you can go to smartgrid.gov. Chattanooga, Tennessee did this. They cut down on power outages. They were able to shift to renewable energy. The potential of a smart grid in Rochester as it relates to renewable energy is enormous. And so that would be what I champion.
This question is directed to Mr. Shepherd. It says, how will you put teeth on your climate summit? What would the outcomes be?
Well, I think in terms of bringing together a summit, I think the most important part of bringing people together is to let them make that determination. One of the things that stands out for me as we go through this process tonight is that a lot of you have a much greater knowledge relative to the things that we need to do, the things we can do, and the things that we should do. And I would like to put that back on you relative to being a part of that summit so that we do things that are achievable, do things that are on timelines, that when those timelines are not met, there are consequences. And I think that in terms of having the correct consequences relative to the things that we put in place, we can have the teeth that we need to make sure those things happen.
I'm pretty anal when it comes to fairness. Is there something you would like to say, Ms. Barnhart?
Sure. I'm a big supporter of the city's climate action plan, which took a lot of people to create, and a lot of stakeholders put a lot of input into that document. I see it as a living document, something that we always have to update at all times, whether it's through a summit or something else. So I think as a city, we've already been doing a lot of hard work bringing people to the table just to even create this plan. But the plan should never stand still.
And you can keep the mic, you're the first respondent. Other cities have implemented wide-ranging energy efficiency programs. What energy efficiency programs would you propose for Rochester?
Right, we've talked about community choice aggregation, which I think presents an enormous opportunity for Rochester, and I'm very pleased to see the city studying this issue, and as mayor, I would make sure that we follow through with this plan. I think shared solar is important as well. If people can't afford to have solar panels, but they're interested in purchasing renewable energy. I think there are so many things that we can do to get people who want to be invested in renewable energy. There are so many programs available. But as I mentioned earlier, people don't know they exist. And we're going to need massive marketing and education programs to let people know they exist. So I think there's a lot that we can do at the city level, from community choice aggregation to shared solar to other programs, to make sure that people are aware that there are incentives and there are things that they can do to be part of this. You don't need to have a lot of money.
And I think there's two things that I would like to champion. Number one, a comprehensive regional transit audit. Not just in terms of the busing system, but in terms of bikes, in terms of walking, in terms of trails, so that we're looking at everything to make a determination of how we can reduce our emissions. I also think it's important, as I talked before, about education and bringing youth into the equation. Because a lot of times if we teach them young, it would become something that becomes part of their standard as they move forward. And so if we have a program of climate literacy established in our schools, we'll see the benefit of it in the long term.
Mr. Shepherd, what strategies can the city implement to increase the use of alternative modes of transportation? And I realize that some of these questions may begin to sound redundant, but that's what we have, and it's just going to challenge your creativity. So what strategies can the city implement to increase the use of alternative modes of transportation and decrease use of the gas-powered car?
And again, I would like to see certain zones within the city that are car-free. You know, and there's different municipalities that I've gone to, particularly in California, where you have, say, where we're filling in the inner loop, where there are no traffic. There's roadways, but there's no traffic because they have ballast at each end, and they've reduced the ability of cars to travel on those roads unless there's a need for it. So that at certain times of the day, they can remove those ballasts and cars are allowable. But when you're having certain events, or if it's during certain times of the day, you can shut down those roadways to nothing but vehicular and bicycle traffic. And again, if you look at it in terms of our entire inner loop, we could have that same rules in place, and anything within that zone would not be driven by cars. It would be a situation where you either had to walk or ride a bike or some other pedestrian mode of transportation.
The only way we're going to reduce vehicle miles traveled is if we make it easier for people to not have to drive. Rochester right now is an incredibly car-dependent city. We don't make it easy to bike to work. We don't make it easy to walk to work. And one of the reasons is that we've allowed jobs to go farther and farther away from the core. And we pay companies to do this, and it's wrong. And we need a mayor who will stand up and fight for the city's interests and fight for our residents and make sure that car first is not the way to go. I mean, one way to think about it is this. It costs about $9,000 a year to own a car. Our residents, the median income for the average worker in the city of Rochester is only $26,000. And what we're seeing is a lot of people getting into predatory subprime auto loans. The need to do this is imperative, and that's how we're going to have to make this case. And but the only way we're going to be able to get people out of their cars is to make it easier.
Thank you. Regarding how to fund the climate action plan, which components of the cap are funded by local tax dollars, and which pieces are supported by state or federal revenues? Let me leave that as one question, and then we'll come back to the other part. And Ms. Barnhart?
Sure, I feel like it was a little bit of a quiz on the climate action plan. You know, certainly when you're talking about infrastructure that gets people out of their vehicles, such as pedestrian infrastructure and bike lanes, a lot of that does come from the local share. But a lot of things come from state programs, and we're going to have to be very aggressive about going after state and federal funding for programs, including solar energy, the solar panels that we're installing. A lot of that was state funding. So the local share, frankly, is mostly infrastructure based and transit based. But even transit, state and federal funding.
Mr. Shepherd, the same question. Which components of the cap are funded by local tax dollars, and which pieces are supported by state or federal revenues?
And in my understanding, the majority of it is funded by federal and state funds. There's a small component of it that is funded by the city. I think in terms of how we continue to do that and do better at it is, as Rachel said, that we continue to advocate to our federal government and to the state government to increase the funds that they provide for us to go green.
Are there local businesses eager to support this? Are you aware of any local businesses eager to support this, Mr. Shepherd and then Ms. Barnhart?
I'm aware of any number of organizations that are interested in that. You know, we have Greentopia that is advocated very strongly relative to what occurs in this city. They are part of the Josiana neighborhood efforts to have urban agriculture. I think that, again, reaching out to the community, reaching out to our neighborhood associations, to those who have a vested interest in our energy consumption and reduction, we include them as part of that process.
Well, speaking of Greentopia, I think if we're able to do an eco-district in the High Falls area, that could really be a model for what green businesses look like working together. So I'm very supportive of that model, and I think it could be a blueprint for the future.
You can hang on to the mic. Okay, This looks rather lengthy. Light pollution is an environmental issue that not only negatively impacts our health, nocturnal wildlife, and our ability to view the night sky, but it can also further compound climate change due to inefficient lighting and energy usage. In the city of Rochester, there are 28,000 street lights. Currently, Rochester only changes lights to energy efficient lighting when a replacement is needed. If elected mayor, do you have any plan to address this issue?
Well, we know that the city of Rochester is going to LED lights for street lights, and this is very important. And the city has gotten funding to do this, I believe $4 million in the last fiscal year. I'm not aware of how far along they are, but it is something very important. There are many reasons to do this. I hadn't thought of light pollution, but I know that the city is working on this and I fully support it. And if there are other things that we can do in terms of making sure that our lighting is energy efficient, then we need to do that as well. But as we saw, this was state funding that came in for the LED lights, and we had to wait for it, and that is something that will come up.
And I think in terms of public safety, I think it's very important for us to have adequate lighting on our streets. I do like the move to the LEDs because they are much more energy efficient. I'm unaware of the fact that we did have light pollution, but in hindsight, I think about the times that I've woken up in the early night and light from somewhere is keeping me awake. So I understand that being a concern. But again, I would not want to be in a position of saying we need to reduce the number of streetlights that we have, because I think it's equally important that we are able to feel safe in our communities and reduce crime through lighting.
So again, let me circle around and ask, if you're elected mayor, what would be your plan to address the issue? I heard your perspective on lighting, but what would be your plan to address the issue of these 28,000 street lights that only get changed when they need to get replaced?
Well, I think if our interest is in energy efficiencies, it should be a matter of us having a detailed plan, a comprehensive plan to change all of our lighting over to LEDs, as opposed to just waiting until the current lights burn out and need to be replaced. We should have a strategy that I will put in place, that we take an approach so that in a certain period of time, and again, if our effort is to reduce our carbon footprint and be energy efficient in a certain period of time, to do that by 2025.
Ms. Barber?
Well, as I said, I mean, it is the city's intention to replace all of these lights. I don't know what progress they've made, or if they are in fact waiting until a light dies before it's replaced. But I see no reason to wait if they have the lights in stock, and that is the question that I have. I'm not aware if they have funding to do all of them, but if they do, they should replace them now.
Mr. Shepherd, would you support a ban on plastic shopping bags? If so, how would you implement such a ban?